Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be going pretty deep on something I think we all can relate to.
Yeah, sounds good.
It's going to be all about how our minds, our psychology, plays this like huge role in how we handle money.
Right.
And to like really get into it, we've got this super insightful source called How Psychology Affects Our Money. It's really cool. It breaks down like 20 major questions
Yeah.
about this whole connection.
Yeah.
Our goal today is, pretty straightforward. We really want to unpack all those, sometimes kind of hidden emotional and mental forces that are like actually behind all of our decisions about money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like getting this clearer picture of why we do the things we do with our finances. And maybe even, coming away with some new ideas about how to make positive changes.
Exactly. And I think a lot of times we really do try to approach money in this, logical, numbers-based way,
Right.
spreadsheets and all that. But what's so interesting about this source is it really highlights right from the beginning that, the way you actually behave with money, the things you do with it, those are all deeply tied to your emotions, to habits that you've built up over time, and even some beliefs that you might not even be, totally aware of, subconsciously influencing you.
Yeah, it's almost like we're trying to act like robots when it comes
Hmm.
to finances.
Right.
But we're so not robots.
Exactly.
There's like this whole other layer. So I think for anyone listening right now, the source has this like really great example that I bet we can all relate to.
Okay.
It talks about how if you tend to associate money with like that sense of security, right?
Mm,
It's all about feeling safe and secure.
right.
You might find yourself saving a ton, like maybe even to a point where it kind of holds you back from enjoying life now.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, it says if you mainly see money as a way to have fun, to just enjoy yourself right now,
Mm.
well then it's pretty easy to fall into that pattern of overspending.
Right. And that's a really interesting point because, we don't always make these like carefully thought out decisions.
Right.
We're not always sitting down and logically thinking, okay, this is what I should do with my money.
Right.
A lot of times it's really driven by those deeper, almost psychological connections that we've built with money.
Mhm.
And so I think, bringing those influences into your awareness, really recognizing, okay, this is how I'm viewing money. Maybe subconsciously that's like the first crucial step to starting to make, better financial choices, more
Right.
conscious ones.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think it makes you realize that, personal finance is way more about emotions than we want to admit sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think when you really think about it, it makes total sense, right? Our habits with money, they didn't just appear out of thin air.
Mm-hmm.
They've been shaped by like a whole bunch of things, like,
Mm-hmm.
how we were raised, like
Yeah.
what our parents taught us, what
Uh-huh.
we saw them doing,
Mm-hmm.
our own life experiences, good and bad, and even just our natural personality. Like some people are just more cautious or more free spending.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if we think about that in the context of kind of the different approaches people take to money,
Hmm.
there's this whole spectrum, right? I mean, you probably met people who are just, naturally very risk averse, very cautious with their money. They really prioritize security.
Mm.
But then you've probably met people who are more on the other side of that spectrum, more impulsive. Maybe they prioritize that immediate gratification, enjoying their money in the moment.
Mm.
And neither of those approaches is right or wrong. It's just how we're wired. But I think the important thing is if you can understand where you tend to fall on that spectrum, and really more importantly, the why behind it,
Hmm.
that's what really helps you, take control of your finances.
Yeah, you're so right about that. The why is so important, and this next point, I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to it. It's about stress,
Okay.
like the stress that comes with financial difficulties.
Mm.
And the source is really upfront about this. Like it says straight out that financial stress can be a real trigger for things like anxiety, even depression and problems sleeping.
Yeah, it's really serious stuff. And I think what's important for everyone to be aware of is this concept of something called decision fatigue.
Okay.
It's basically like when you're under a lot of financial strain, it actually depletes your mental resources, you know?
Hmm.
It becomes way harder to think clearly about money to make those rational decisions. And unfortunately, that can lead to making even more not so great financial choices, which just, perpetuates the cycle.
Right.
And it doesn't stop there either. The source even mentions how chronic stress about money, it doesn't just affect you mentally. It can actually manifest physically too. Like it can contribute to things like high blood pressure.
Yeah, it's almost like a vicious cycle,
Hmm.
Like you feel stressed about money, so you don't manage it well. And then because you're not managing it well, you get even more stressed.
Exactly.
It's rough.
Yeah. And kind of on that note, the source goes into why some people just avoid dealing with finances altogether.
Mm.
And it's not always, just laziness or procrastination.
Right.
There's often, these deeper psychological factors at play.
Absolutely. Financial avoidance is often tied to, some kind of underlying fear,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a fear of failure or a fear of not being good enough.
Mm-hmm.
You
Maybe it stems from, past financial difficulties. Or maybe it's just a lack of confidence in your own ability to handle money.
Right.
And, the source has this pretty dark example that some people might recognize, which is like, avoiding looking at bank statements or putting off opening bills because it just, causes this intense anxiety.
Yeah, I've definitely been there. Like the mail comes and you don't even want to touch it.
Exactly.
Scary.
Yeah. But the thing is, as tempting as it is to just avoid things, it rarely makes the problem go away. In
Right.
fact, usually ignoring financial problems just lets them, grow and become even bigger over time.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like avoiding a health problem, right?
Right.
The sooner you address it, the better the outcome will probably be.
Exactly. So then the big question becomes, where do these deep-seated financial attitudes even come from?
Right.
Like, how do we develop these views about money that are so strong?
Mm-hmm.
And the source really shines a light on this by talking about how childhood experiences with money have this huge impact on our adult financial mindset.
Yeah.
It's like those early years are so important for laying the foundation, for how we think and feel about money even as grown-ups.
Right. Those early experiences, they really lay down the groundwork for a lot of our beliefs about money.
Mm-hmm.
And the source paints this really clear picture. Like, for example, someone who grew up in a household where money was always a source of stress and worry. Maybe there wasn't enough of it. They might develop what's often called a scarcity mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And this can lead to, constant underlying worry about financial security, even when they reach a point where they're relatively comfortable financially.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, someone who was raised in an environment of, financial abundance, never really having to worry about money, they might actually find themselves struggling with things like budgeting later in life because they never had to think about it growing up.
Right.
So it's like these early experiences can almost create these automatic responses to financial situations later in life.
Right.
And these aren't always, conscious, rational decisions that you're making. They're more like these deep-seated patterns of thinking and behaving that you learned very early on, like almost programmed into you.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So let's move into this next part. It's about the role emotions play in how we manage money day to day.
Okay.
And the source brings up several areas where our feelings can really, lead us down a path we might regret later.
Mm-hmm.
And first up is something I think we all can relate to: emotional overspending.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
You're feeling a little down or stressed, and then all of a sudden you find yourself like with a shopping cart full of things you didn't really need.
Yeah, totally. And the source actually does a really good job of explaining why this happens. It says that, shopping can become this almost a coping mechanism for dealing with difficult emotions. It gives you this little temporary boost of dopamine, that feel-good chemical in your brain. So when you're feeling sad, anxious, stressed, you go shopping, you get this little hit of happiness.
Right.
And then unfortunately, that feeling can be a little addictive. And it leads to this cycle of impulsive buying followed by, regret and financial strain.
Right.
So it's really this emotional cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then there's this big one that I think affects so many people: fear and investing. It's like this huge barrier for a lot of people. And the source explains how fear can often prevent people from taking calculated financial risks, even when the potential long-term rewards could be really good, you know?
Right.
Like it could really benefit them.
Yeah, I think a really common example of this is the fear of, stock market downturns.
Hmm.
You see the market going up and down, and it's scary, and it can keep people on the sidelines,
Hmm.
and they end up missing out on, years of potential growth in their investments.
Right.
So it really can be a big missed opportunity.
Yeah, and that fear, it's not just like keeping people from getting started with investing, you know.
Hmm.
It can also lead to something called panic selling,
Right.
which is it's it's like when the market dips,
Hmm.
instead of, riding it out, people get so scared that they just sell everything
Exactly.
and then they lock in their losses.
Right.
And it's like the worst thing you can do, really.
It is.
It's emotions taking over.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how emotions can really override that more rational, logical approach to your finances.
Yeah, it's so easy to say, "Oh, just ride it out, don't panic." But when you're actually in it,
Right.
it's hard.
So much harder.
So another interesting thing the source talks about is the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
It's like, I know I've been guilty of this. It's that feeling of, you've got an investment that's losing money,
Mm-hmm.
but you just can't let it go because you've already put so much into it.
Right. Right.
Like, well, I've come this far, I can't quit now, even though logically maybe you should.
Exactly, and I think what really drives this is that reluctance we all have to admit a loss.
Hmm.
Emotionally, it can feel like, you're admitting failure,
Right.
but financially, it can be a much bigger mistake to keep throwing good money after bad, so to speak.
Right.
So you really gotta be aware of that.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's this whole thing about confidence, right?
Yeah.
So the source talks about how, having too much confidence can actually be a bad thing for your finances.
Hmm.
But then also not having enough confidence can also be a problem. So it's like it's this weird balance.
It is. It is. And on the one hand, if you're overconfident, it can lead to taking, big risks, like making bad investment choices or spending way more than you should because you feel invincible,
Right. Like you can't lose.
Exactly.
Right.
But then on the other hand, if you lack confidence in your ability to handle money, you might be overly cautious. You might miss out on some really great opportunities.
Mm.
So the key, as the source points out, is to find that balance.
Mm.
It's about having confidence, but backing it up with, knowledge and planning.
Right.
So it's not just blindly jumping into things.
Right.
It's being informed and realistic about your abilities.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of the last thing under this whole emotional umbrella
Okay.
is this idea of guilt, like feeling guilty about spending money.
Mm-hmm.
And the source specifically talks about how, people who grew up with that scarcity mindset,
Mm-hmm.
they might have this really deep association between spending money and being irresponsible, right?
Right.
Or selfish even.
Exactly.
And so even when they reach a point where, they're financially stable,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard for them to really enjoy spending on things that they value,
Right.
because they're just always worried about saving.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a powerful thing.
It is, and it's a really great example of how, your past can really impact your present behavior when it comes to money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so far we've looked at the emotional side of things, right?
Mhm.
But now let's get into these mental shortcuts that our brains take, these cognitive biases.
Oh, right.
They're like these little tricks our minds play on us
Right.
that can lead us to make like predictable mistakes with our money.
Yeah.
And the first one up is something called present bias.
Mm.
This one gets me all the time.
Okay.
It's basically that we tend to place a much higher value on rewards that we can get right now
Mhm.
compared to those that come later in the future.
Right.
Like it's that instant gratification thing.
Exactly.
So for someone, this might look like, spending a big chunk of their paycheck on things they want now
Mm-hmm.
instead of saving for retirement, even though they know logically saving for retirement is better in the long run.
Right.
But it's just that instant reward is so tempting.
It is.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, the source kind of suggests that to really combat this, you gotta set those long-term financial goals,
Mhm.
and then the less fun part, you gotta develop self-discipline.
Right.
You gotta find ways to resist those urges to spend in the moment and really focus on that long-term benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. And then there's this one that I think we've all heard of. It's called Keeping Up with the Joneses, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or social comparison is the fancier term for it.
Right.
And let's be real, social media has made this like 10 times worse
Oh, okay.
because you're constantly seeing, these perfect pictures of everyone's amazing lives and, all the cool stuff they have.
Mm,
And it puts this pressure on you to overspend
right.
on things you don't need.
Exactly. And the source is pretty clear that this, desire to keep up with others can lead you to spend on things like, luxury items,
Mhm.
fancy vacations, bigger homes, even when your financial situation maybe doesn't really allow for it. It's like this classic example of how, those external influences can impact your internal decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So another kind of sneaky one that the source brings up is underestimating our spending.
Okay.
This is something I've definitely done. It's connected to this thing called the optimism bias,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically we tend to think we're better at managing money than we actually are.
Right.
So like you might not track your small everyday expenses because you just assume they don't add up to much.
Mm.
But of course they do.
They really do.
Right. Like all those coffees and snacks and stuff,
Yeah, it adds up.
it adds up. So what's the fix for that?
Well, I think for this one, it's really about being more mindful.
Mhm.
Actually tracking where your money is going,
Mhm.
even those small purchases,
Right.
creating a budget and sticking to it.
Mm.
Those are really effective ways to counteract this tendency to underestimate how much you're actually spending.
Yeah, I think I need to get better at that.
Me too.
So the source also talks about this thing called anchoring bias. Have you ever heard of that one?
Yeah, I have.
It's kind of an interesting one. It's like when you get stuck on the very first piece of information you hear.
Mm-hmm.
When you're making a decision.
Right.
So for example, if you used to earn a really high salary,
Mm-hmm.
but then, maybe you switched jobs or something and your income changed.
Mm-hmm.
You might still have trouble adjusting your spending habits because you're anchored to that old salary.
Exactly. It's like that initial high salary becomes this reference point,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be really hard to recalibrate, to adjust your spending to your new reality.
Right.
And that can lead to problems down the road.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last one the source brings up is get rich quick schemes.
Mm.
And this is a big one, right?
It is.
It's like it seems like that desire to get rich really fast, it can actually make you overconfident.
Mm.
Like you start thinking you can outsmart the system
Right.
and you end up making bad decisions.
Exactly.
So what does the source say about that?
Well, the source points out that, this overconfidence combined with the allure of getting rich quickly, it can make you more susceptible to, scams, risky investments that probably won't pay off,
Mm-hmm.
and even things like excessive gambling. It's like the promise of those quick riches, just it clouds your judgment.
Yeah, you stop thinking clearly.
Clearly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot of the psychological traps that can affect our finances, but the good news is the source also has some solid advice on how we can actually develop better habits.
Okay, good.
And the first thing it talks about is developing this healthier mindset about money.
Mm.
Like it's almost like changing your attitude towards it.
Right.
So what are some tips for that?
Well, according to the source, it's about first identifying those negative beliefs that you might have about money, and then consciously working to replace those with more positive, more empowering ones.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests, things like reading personal finance books, listening to podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully this one is helpful.
Of course.
And even just practicing gratitude for the financial progress that you do make, no matter how small it might seem. It's really about rewiring those thought patterns.
Yeah, it's like retraining your brain.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So then the source also really emphasizes self-discipline, right?
Mhm.
Which I know it's not the most fun thing to talk about, but
Yeah.
it's so important.
It really is.
So why is it so important?
Well, it's what helps you stick to your budget.
Mhm.
The one you created and said, okay, I'm going to follow this. It helps you save money regularly,
Hmm.
and it helps you stay committed to your investment plan, even when things get tough.
Right.
So it's really that key ingredient to actually reaching your financial
Yeah,
goals.
it's what separates, having a plan and actually following through on it.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And the source even suggests that building self-discipline can start with small habits,
Hmm.
like setting up automatic transfers to your savings account.
Hmm.
That way, you're not even tempted to spend that money because it's already gone.
Right, right. That's smart. So for a lot of people, the fear of investing can be really paralyzing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to think about it. So what does the source suggest for that?
Well, the source actually offers a really straightforward and empowering solution, which is education.
Mm.
It's about taking the time to learn how investing actually works.
Hmm.
Starting small so you feel more comfortable with the process, and adopting this long-term perspective, not getting caught up in the day-to-day ups and downs of the market.
Right.
The source even mentions index funds and diversified investments as potentially good starting points,
Hmm.
especially for people who are, naturally more cautious.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally, if you're trying to reduce financial stress, the source really highlights financial planning,
Right.
which, might sound simple, but it can make a big difference.
It really can.
So how does that work?
Well, having a plan in place, it just creates this feeling of control.
Hmm.
You understand where your money's going, you have clear goals.
Hmm.
We're not just kind of drifting along.
Hmm.
And that can really reduce those feelings of overwhelm and stress.
Hmm.
A good plan will also help you prepare for emergencies, which can, really ease that anxiety when those unexpected expenses pop up.
Right, you're not caught off guard.
Exactly.
Okay, so last but not least, for people who are trying to break bad financial habits,
Mm-hmm.
the source has this really clear first step.
Okay.
It's about awareness,
Right.
like
Right.
recognizing what triggers those unwanted behaviors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got to figure out what those situations or emotions are that tend to lead to those, those habits you want to change.
Hmm.
And then you can start to explore and implement, different, more positive ways of coping.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you know that stress often leads to, overspending, maybe you could try incorporating things like exercise or meditation into your routine,
Right.
healthier ways to deal with that stress. And the source also suggests gradually replacing those negative habits with more positive ones.
Hmm.
Like maybe cooking at home more often instead of eating out all the time.
Right, right.
It's about making these sustainable changes over time.
Yeah, I think that's key. Like it's got to be something you can actually stick with.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's so clear that, our emotions, our past experiences, those cognitive biases, they all play this huge role in how we handle money,
They really do.
bigger than we might realize.
Yeah.
And I think the main takeaway here is that by understanding these things, those emotional triggers, the biases, the patterns, we can make better choices.
Absolutely.